Okay, so, when you're really trying to get into the nuts and bolts of AI management,
Yep.
sometimes it can feel
Sure.
like you're kind of being handed this really complicated instruction manual.
Yeah.
Like you see the big picture, you get the general concept, but those practical steps can
I,
seem a little bit, well, abstract, let's just say.
yeah, I completely agree.
And it's exactly why we're taking a deep dive into Annex B of ISO IEC 42001.2023 today.
Absolutely.
So think of this as like a super focused workshop,
Okay.
like a guided session where we're going to unpack this seriously important part of the standard together
Yeah.
and really makes those practical steps much clearer and a lot more actionable
Right.
for, everyone who's listening and wants to actually implement these things.
I like that, a workshop.
Yeah.
Because you're right. People are really interested in moving beyond, just the theory of AI risk management. Like, how do you actually do this stuff?
Right, exactly.
ISO IEC 42001.2023 gives us this great framework, but it's Annex B where things really get real. Yes.
For a lot of the key controls around AI. And it's important to highlight that Annex B is a normative part of that standard.
Okay, so what does that really mean for, someone who's trying to implement this?
Well, it means that if your organization is saying, A, we're conforming to this standard for all the
Right.
specific AI controls that are listed out in Table A.1,
Okay.
then the recommendations that you find in Annex B for those controls,
Yeah.
they aren't just suggestions anymore. It's what you're actually expected to do.
Okay.
Like you need to seriously consider these things, and most likely you're going to have to actually implement them.
So it's not just like, oh, this is good advice. This is like,
No, it's much stronger than that.
yeah.
It's like if you were going to some, hands-on training session to really learn these skills.
Exactly, yeah.
So Table A.1 is kind of like your list of all the, essential AI skills that you need to master.
Right, okay.
And Annex B is like having those detailed tutorials for, how to actually develop those skills.
Love that analogy. Yeah. Okay, so just to make sure I'm following this correctly.
Yeah.
The main standard, like ISO IEC 42001.2023, that sets out all those high-level requirements.
Right.
Then you've got Table A.1, which gives you this list of very specific controls.
Exactly, yeah. It's like a menu of controls. You get to pick and choose which ones are relevant.
I like that, a menu. And then Annex B.
Yeah.
That's where you get those super detailed instructions for actually putting those specific controls into practice.
You got it.
Right. But all the while, you're keeping in mind
Yeah.
your organization's unique goals and the general steps for implementing this stuff.
Exactly. You have to tailor it to your specific needs.
Now, just a quick practical question, because I know a lot of people were probably wondering this.
Yeah, sure.
Does an organization actually have to document, like formally document,
Right.
every single decision they make about how they're using Annex B?
That's a great question, and it's something that B.1 actually clarifies for us.
Okay.
So it explicitly says that organizations don't have to document or justify
Okay.
every single time that they include or exclude a piece of implementation guidance from Annex B
Okay.
in their statement of applicability.
Yeah.
And that statement of applicability is linked to Clause 6.1.3.
Got it.
So while the guidance is definitely normative for those controls you picked from Table A.1,
Right.
the exact way that your organization applies it or even modifies it,
Okay.
you don't necessarily need to write down why you did that for every single little thing.
So it sounds like there's a certain degree of, pragmatic application allowed here.
Exactly.
So Annex B isn't like this rigid set of rules that everyone has to follow to the letter.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The standard recognizes that every organization is different.
Right.
They work in different contexts, they face different challenges,
Mhm.
and so B1 really emphasizes that the guidance in Annex B,
Yeah.
it might not always be a perfect fit for every single situation.
Okay.
So organizations have that flexibility to, adapt the guidance,
Okay.
or even come up with their own implementation methods. Okay, so they can kind of make it their own.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but,
Yeah.
any adaptation or anything new that they create,
Yep.
it's got to be based on their specific organizational context and their needs for treating those AI risks.
Okay, so it's really about using the knowledge that's there to build a solution that works for you.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's more like a starting point, a solid starting point.
Yes, B1 actually concludes by saying that Annex B is intended to be a foundational resource.
Okay, great.
The goal is to help organizations develop their own specific approaches
Okay.
to implement those AI controls that they've identified as necessary to address their risks. And again, this ties back to 6.1.3 on risk treatment.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like this, really comprehensive set of best practice suggestions
Yes.
that you can then customize to make it work for your organization,
Yes.
your specific situation, and, whatever risk you're facing.
You got it.
Okay, let's dig into the next part, B2, which is all about policies related to AI. What's the main objective here? What are we trying to learn?
So B2.1 tells us that the objective here is to give management the right guidance and support for those AI systems.
Okay.
Making sure that how they're developed and how they're used all lines up with the business requirements for the organization.
So it's about, setting those clear expectations right from the start.
Yes, setting the tone from the top.
Yeah, and making sure that, AI is woven into the business in a way that supports those strategic goals.
Exactly.
All right, so the first specific area we're going to look at under that is B.2.2,
Okay.
which deals with having a documented AI policy. What needs to be in that policy? What are the essential elements?
So the control itself is pretty straightforward.
Okay.
You need to have a policy that's written down
Okay.
that specifically talks about how AI systems are developed or used or both.
Okay.
But the implementation guidance unpacks this a little bit more.
Right.
And talks about all the factors that should really inform the content of your AI policy.
All right, so what are some of those factors?
Well, it starts with your overall business strategy.
Okay, so AI policy should be driven by that.
Definitely. It needs to reflect your core values
Okay.
and the culture of your organization.
Okay, so like if you have a company that's generally kind of, cautious about new ventures, their AI policy should reflect that.
Yes, exactly. You also have to think about the level of risk
Right.
that the organization is willing to accept or retain.
Okay.
And it has to take into account any legal requirements, including any contracts you might have,
Okay.
and the broader risk environment that your organization operates in.
So it's all very contextual.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And you also have to think about the potential impact of AI systems on all those interested parties.
Okay, so all the stakeholders, the people who are affected by this.
Exactly. And that links back to 6.1.4, which is all about, understanding the needs and expectations of those different parties.
Okay, so that's a pretty long list of things to think about.
It is. It's quite comprehensive.
When you're shaping that AI policy, what about the actual content of the policy itself?
Okay, so beyond the general requirements for policies, which are spelled out in 5.2,
Okay.
your AI policy should clearly articulate the core principles that are going to guide all your organization's activities related to AI.
Got it. So it's like your central AI doctrine.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It also needs to outline the processes for handling any deviations or exceptions to the policy.
Okay.
And importantly, it should address specific topics
Okay.
where more detailed guidance might be needed or where you might need to cross-reference other policies.
So it's like the main document, but it can point to other, more operational procedures if needed.
Exactly.
And you mentioned some examples of those specific topical areas.
Right. So some of the examples the guidance gives are how you manage your AI resources and assets.
Right.
And then also AI system impact assessments, which links back to 6.1.4.
Right.
And the processes involved in AI system development.
So really any area where AI introduces some unique risks or considerations, that needs to be addressed either in the policy itself or by pointing to another relevant policy.
Exactly.
Okay, and then just to wrap up B.2.2, it says that these relevant policies should provide guidance throughout the entire lifespan of AI systems.
That's right.
From development all the way through to their retirement.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not enough to just have this AI policy and assume it covers everything.
Right. It has to work with all the other policies in your organization.
Exactly, and that's where BO 2.3 comes in alignment with other organizational policies.
Yeah.
What's the key takeaway here?
Well, the main control is that you have to figure out where your existing policies might be affected by or might affect your organization's objectives for AI.
Okay.
The implementation guidance really stresses that AI doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
It touches so many different parts of an organization. So think about things like quality management, information, security, safety, data, privacy. All these areas can be impacted by AI.
Yeah, for sure.
So your AI policy needs to work with all of those.
So you can't just create a policy and think, okay, we're done.
No, you really have to analyze things and figure out where your current policies need to be updated.
Right.
Maybe you need completely new policies to deal with specific AI stuff.
Right.
The guidance says you can either update those existing policies or you can include things in your main AI policy that cover those other areas.
Right.
The main thing is to make sure that there are no gaps.
Okay.
And that everything is covered consistently across all your policies.
So it's about having that coordinated and holistic approach.
Exactly.
And there's another information section in B.2.3 as well. Anything important in there?
Yes. This part of the guidance talks about keeping the governing body of your organization in the loop. So they need to know what's in the AI policy and what it means for the organization.
So keeping the leadership informed.
Exactly. And it specifically points to IEC 38507, which gives guidance for those governing bodies on how to manage and oversee AI systems throughout their entire life cycle.
All right, so that's a really important part of ensuring buy-in and accountability at the highest level.
Exactly.
Okay, so the last thing in this section on policies is B.2.4, review of the AI policy.
Okay.
What's the control here and what's the practical guidance?
The control says that your AI policy shouldn't just sit on a shelf and gather dust.
Right.
It needs to be reviewed regularly.
Okay.
At planned intervals or if something changes.
Okay.
And you need to make sure that it's still suitable for your organization's needs and that it's adequate and effective.
Okay.
So the implementation guidance clarifies that someone should be in charge of this.
Okay. So a specific role, someone who owns this policy.
Yeah, exactly. And they need to have the authority from management to develop, review, and evaluate the AI policy and everything that's part of it.
Got it. So someone's accountable.
Exactly. And the review process should include looking at how you can improve your policy and your overall approach to managing AI.
Okay.
And that means considering any changes in your internal or external environment.
Right.
Like maybe there are some new business circumstances or new laws, or maybe there's been a change in the technology.
Well, it's about adapting to that changing landscape.
Absolutely. And the guidance also says that the review of the AI policy should consider anything that's come out of management reviews.
Okay.
So it's all about continuous improvement, making sure your policy stays relevant and effective.
I like that. All right, let's move on to B.3, which focuses on internal organization.
Okay.
The objective here, as stated in B.3.1, is to establish clear accountability within the organization to support that responsible approach to AI.
Right.
So how does B.3.2, which deals with AI roles and responsibilities, contribute to that objective?
B.3.2 says that you need to define specific roles and responsibilities related to AI within your organization.
All right.
And you have to assign those roles to actual people.
Okay, so people have to know who's doing what.
Exactly. And this should all be based on the needs of your organization.
Okay.
The implementation guidance really stresses that this is super important.
Right.
Because it ensures accountability throughout the entire life cycle of any AI system.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. You don't want things falling through the cracks.
Right. And it makes sure that people's responsibilities align with the AI policies.
Okay.
The objectives and the risks.
Right.
Because without clear roles, it's easy for things to get missed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So who are some of the key people or groups within an organization that might need these AI roles?
Well, the guidance gives us a pretty big list of examples. Of course, there's risk management specifically for AI.
Okay.
There's the people doing AI system impact assessments.
Right.
And the folks managing all the AI resources and assets. Then you've got information security, safety, privacy, the development of AI systems, monitoring their performance, human oversight, managing those supplier relationships, proving you can meet legal requirements, and probably most importantly, managing data quality throughout the entire process.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is.
Is there any guidance on, how much detail you need to go into when defining these roles?
Yeah, so the guidance says that the responsibilities for each role should be defined to a level that's appropriate for those individuals to do their jobs effectively. Okay,
so enough detail so that people know what's expected of them.
Exactly. It's about avoiding confusion and making sure that everyone's on the same page.
Makes sense. Now, B.3.3 talks about reporting of concerns.
Okay.
So what's the main control here, and what's the guidance on how to implement it?
The control in B.3.3 says that you need a way for people to report any concerns that they have about the organization's AI activities.
Okay.
And this should cover the entire life cycle of the AI systems. Right.
So the implementation guidance goes into detail about how this reporting mechanism should work.
So what are some of the key features it should have?
Well, firstly, it should allow for confidentiality,
Okay.
anonymity, or both.
Right. So people feel safe coming forward.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be available to everyone,
Okay.
whether they're employed directly or they're a contractor.
Right, right.
And it needs to be staffed by qualified people who can actually investigate and resolve those concerns.
Okay, so people need to know that their concerns are being taken seriously.
Absolutely.
What else should be included in this reporting mechanism?
It should also have clear processes for reporting concerns and escalating them to management if needed.
Right.
And there needs to be protection against retaliation.
Right.
Both for the person reporting the concern and the people involved in investigating it.
That's important.
Yeah. And it should also allow for reports in line with 4.4 and other relevant clauses where appropriate.
Right. While still protecting confidentiality and anonymity.
Okay.
And of course, respecting general business confidentiality.
Okay.
And finally, there should be a clear process for responding to those concerns within a reasonable time frame.
So it sounds like a very robust system for managing concerns.
It is.
Does the standard say anything about how organizations actually set this up?
Yeah, the guidance says that organizations can use existing reporting mechanisms if they already have something that works for other types of concerns.
All right, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. But they need to make sure that those mechanisms meet the specific requirements in B.3.3.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to AI.
Right. And the other information section mentions ISO 37002.
Yeah, it advises organizations to look at that standard as well.
Okay.
Because it focuses specifically on whistleblowing management systems.
All right, so there's another useful resource there.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're getting into B4, resources for AI systems. And the objective here is to make sure that the organization has a full understanding of all the resources that are needed for their AI system so they can really address the risks and the potential impacts.
Makes sense.
And B.4.2 is all about resource documentation.
Yeah.
So what needs to be documented here?
The control in B.4.2 says you have to identify and document all the resources that are required for all your AI activities.
Yeah.
And this documentation needs to cover all the stages of an AI system's life.
Okay.
From development to deployment, operation, maintenance, retirement, and anything else related to AI in your organization.
Okay.
And the implementation guidance emphasizes that this is absolutely critical for understanding both the risks of the system and the potential impacts, both positive and negative, on individuals, groups, and society as a whole.
So you need to know what you're working with to manage it properly.
Exactly.
And it mentions using data flow diagrams and system architecture diagrams.
Yeah, those can be really useful. And it also says that this documentation can inform the AI system impact assessment.
Right, which we'll be talking about in a little bit.
Right, and it gives some examples of the types of resources that should be documented.
Okay, so what are some of the key examples?
Well, first you've got the AI system components themselves, like the algorithms and the models.
Okay.
Then all your data resources, any data that's used at any point in the AI system's life, including training data, validation data, and production data.
Right.
You've got tooling resources, things like specific algorithms or tools that are used in development and deployment.
Okay.
And then the system and computing resources, the hardware you need to run everything.
Right.
And the storage you need for your data and tools.
Right.
And of course, the human resources, the people with the right expertise to build and run the AI system.
It sounds like a very comprehensive view of what goes into an AI system.
It is. You have to think about all the different pieces.
And does it say anything about who might be providing those resources?
Yeah, the guidance specifically says that these resources might not all come from within your organization.
Right, so they could be from customers or third-party suppliers.
Exactly. You need to know where everything is coming from to manage it properly.
Makes sense. What about the other information section?
That section makes a good point about how documenting these resources can help you figure out if those resources are actually available.
Right, so if you're missing something critical, you might need to rethink your design or your deployment plans.
Exactly.
Okay, so B.4.3 then goes into more detail about data resources specifically.
Right.
What extra documentation do you need for the data that feeds these AI systems?
The control in B.4.3 builds on what we just talked about.
Okay.
It says, as part of your resource identification, you should specifically document information about all the data that's used by the AI system.
Right.
And the implementation guidance outlines the kinds of information that should be included.
So what are some of the key things that need to be documented about data resources?
Well, first, you need to document the provenance of the data, where it originally came from.
Right.
And then you need to record the date when the data was last updated or modified.
Okay.
Maybe you can include a date tag in the metadata.
Got it.
If you're using machine learning,
Yeah.
then you need to clearly identify the different categories of data that you're using.
Okay, like training data, validation data,
Yeah.
test data, production data.
Exactly. And you should also classify the types of data that are being used.
Okay.
Maybe by using a standardized system like the one defined in ISO IC 19944-1.
Yeah.
You also need to document the process you use for labeling the data, what the data is being used for in the AI system, and an assessment of its overall quality.
Okay, so how good is the data, essentially?
Exactly. And you could refer to frameworks like the ISO IEC 5259 series to help you with that.
Okay.
And then you need to document your data retention and disposal policies,
Right.
any known or potential bias issues in the data, and a description of how the data was prepared for use in the AI system.
So that's a lot of detail about the data itself.
It is.
Okay, so now we've got B4.4 tooling resources.
Okay.
What information needs to be documented about the tools used to build and deploy AI systems?
So the control here is similar to the one for data.
Okay.
You need to document information about all the tooling resources that
Yeah.
you're using for the AI system.
Right.
And the guidance gives some examples of what those tooling resources might be,
Okay.
especially for machine learning.
Right. So what are some of the things that need to be documented?
This would include things like the types of algorithms and machine learning models that you're using,
Okay.
any tools or processes you used for data conditioning, optimization methods, evaluation methods, provisioning tools for resources,
Okay.
tools for model development, and the software and hardware for design, development, and deployment.
So it's about documenting the specific tools and techniques that you're using. And it mentions ISO IEC TR 20533
Yeah, that's a good resource.
for more guidance on tooling resources in machine learning.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, next up is B.4.5 system and computing resources.
Okay.
What needs to be documented in this area?
It's similar to the previous two sections.
Right.
You need to document information about your system and computing resources.
Okay, so the infrastructure that the AI system runs on.
Exactly.
So what kind of information are we talking about here?
The guidance says that you should include things like the resource requirements of the AI system,
Okay.
like how much processing power, memory, and storage it needs.
Okay.
That helps make sure that the system can run even on devices with limited resources.
Right, so thinking about where the AI system might be deployed.
Exactly.
You also need to specify where those resources are located,
Okay.
whether they're on premises or in the cloud or at the edge.
Got it.
And of course, you need to document details about the processing resources like network bandwidth and storage capacity.
And the guidance highlights the importance of considering the impact of the hardware,
Okay.
both in terms of the environment and the cost.
Yeah, so thinking about sustainability and budget.
Exactly.
And there's a note in the guidance about considering resources for continuous improvement.
Yes, it's important to remember that you might need different resources to support the ongoing improvement of your AI systems.
So you might need different things for development versus deployment versus operation.
Exactly.
And it mentions ISO IEC 282989 for more details on system resource considerations.
That's right.
Okay. So last up in the resource section, we have B.4.6, human resources.
Okay.
What documentation is required for the people involved in the AI system's lifecycle?
This control requires you to document information about the people and their responsibilities across all stages of the AI system's life.
Okay.
So development, deployment operation, change management, maintenance, transfer, decommissioning, verification, and integration.
So it's all about knowing who's doing what at each stage.
Exactly.
And the guidance talks about the need for diverse expertise.
Yes, it's really important to consider the different types of roles that you need for the AI system to work properly.
Okay.
And it even mentions that for machine learning, you might want to think about including specific demographic groups related to the data sets.
Right, especially if that's important for the design of the system.
Exactly.
And then it gives some examples of human resources like data scientists, people involved in oversight, experts on trustworthiness, researchers, and specialists and domain experts.
Yeah, you need a lot of different people with different skills.
And those people might change depending on the stage of the life cycle.
Absolutely.
Okay, that was a lot of information about resources.
It was, but it's all important for managing AI systems effectively.
It is. Let's move on to B.5, assessing impacts of AI systems.
Okay.
The objective here is to assess those potential impacts on individuals, groups, and society throughout the AI system's entire lifecycle.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And B.5.2 is about the AI system impact assessment process. So what are the key elements of that process?
The control in B.5.2 says that you need a formal process to assess the potential consequences of your AI systems. And this includes both positive and negative consequences for individuals, groups, and society as a whole. And this assessment needs to cover the entire life of the system. The guidance goes on to talk about the things you should consider when doing this assessment.
So what are some of those key considerations?
Well, you have to think about the potential impact on people's legal rights and opportunities, their physical and psychological well-being, universal human rights, and the broader consequences for society.
So it's a very broad view of impact.
Yes, very comprehensive.
And what should the procedures for these impact assessments look like?
So your procedures should clearly state when an impact assessment needs to be done.